Whisper Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1886. The little white church stood at the edge of town, with the Wind River peaks rising sharp and snow-capped behind it. Wildflowers growing wild along the fence line, where somebody had once planted them with more hope than order. And Adaline Frost sat at the wooden table set up outside its doors, with a quill in her hand and a marriage license in front of her that she'd known this man exactly 9 days. A hawk circled somewhere high above the church steeple, riding the thermals rising off the warming mountain slopes, entirely indifferent to the small, urgent drama unfolding beneath it. "I want to be clear about something before I sign this," she said, not looking up from the paper, her handwriting careful and deliberate, despite how quickly everything around her had happened. "I'm only marrying you to save your life, Cade Ferris. Whatever this looks like to the Reverend, or to the town, or to you. That's the whole of my reason, and I'd rather say it plainly now than let either of us pretend otherwise later." Cade Ferris sat beside her at the small table, his wide-brimmed hat pushed back, the Wyoming sun catching the gold in his beard, and said nothing at all. Simply watched her sign her name with an expression that carried considerably more warmth than a man being married purely as a legal formality had any right to wear. "You're not going to argue with that," Adaline said, glancing at him. "Wasn't planning to," Cade said, finally, the smile still sitting easy on his face. Man doesn't usually argue with the reason the woman's willing to give him a future he wasn't sure he'd live long enough to have. Whatever the reason turns out to actually be, underneath the one you've decided to say out loud. Reverend Aldous Kane, standing witness with his worn Bible held against his chest, cleared his throat gently. "Might I ask you both to finish signing before the philosophy gets too involved? Some of us have another service this afternoon." Neither of them could have fully explained, standing there in that bright mountain morning, with a killer's deadline bearing down on them both, exactly how 9 days had carried them from strangers to this, nor how much more complicated the truth of Adaline's reasons would become before the year was through. Adaline Frost had arrived in Whisper Creek 4 months earlier, carrying her late father's medical bag and a competence at doctoring that the town had been slow to trust from a woman, however capable her hands proved once given the chance to demonstrate it. Her father had been a country physician back in Ohio, and Adaline had spent her whole childhood at his side, absorbing the practical education of tending wounds, setting bones, and reading a fever's progress the way other girls absorbed needlework, until his death 2 years earlier from a heart that simply gave out one ordinary evening, left her with nothing but his medical knowledge, his instruments, and a modest inheritance that wouldn't stretch indefinitely in a town where every eligible physician's position was already filled by men considerably less qualified than she was. She'd spent the 2 years since that loss proving, patient by patient, small town by small town, that the knowledge in her hands mattered considerably more than the fact of her sex, though the proving itself had exhausted her more than the actual work ever did. She'd come west on the strength of a letter from a former patient of her father's, now settled in Wyoming Territory, who'd assured her that frontier towns cared considerably less about a doctor's gender than about a doctor's competence when a child was fevered or a leg was broken badly enough to need proper setting. Whisper Creek had proven that promise only partially true. She'd built a modest practice, tending the town's women and children readily enough, while most of the ranchers and cowhands still preferred to ride the extra distance to the territorial doctor in the county seat rather than trust a woman with anything more serious than a cold. She'd told herself, some evenings, that the mountains at least never questioned her competence, the peaks rising the same magnificent, indifferent purple every sunset, whether the town below trusted her or not, and had found in that indifference a strange sort of comfort during the loneliest stretches of her first months in the territory, sitting alone on her small porch, watching the light change over ridgelines that asked nothing of her at all. Cade Ferris had been the first man in Whisper Creek to seek her out directly, rather than as a last resort. arriving at her small office 9 days before that wedding, with a gash along his ribs he'd explained away as a fence-mending accident, an explanation Adaline had accepted at face value, right up until she'd actually examined the wound. Her father's training had left her with a specific, hard-won clarity about such things. Fence wire didn't cut in the clean, deliberate line a blade left behind. Cade was 30 years old, had inherited the Ferris ranch 3 months earlier upon his own father's death from a fever that had taken hold fast and cruel, and had discovered, reading the old man's will in the county clerk's office, a stipulation that had struck him at the time as both baffling and fatally insulting. Elias Ferris had built the ranch from nothing across 30 hard years in the Wind River Valley, and had watched his only son grow into a capable rancher, but a reckless bachelor, prone to poor judgment where women and cards were concerned, prone to the kind of restless dissatisfaction that worried a father who understood exactly how easily a ranch could be lost to a man without steady partnership to balance his instincts. Elias had written into his will, in his final year, a clause requiring Cade to marry within 6 months of his father's death in order to inherit the ranch outright, believing, in his own old-fashioned way, that he was forcing his son toward the kind of stability that would serve him well, never once imagining the clause might instead paint a target on Cade's back. If Cade failed to marry within that window, the will specified the ranch would pass instead to Roland Voss, a cousin on Elias's late wife's side, whom Elias had never fully trusted, a man who'd spent years drifting between failed ventures across 3 territories and had shown up in Whisper Creek within a month of Elias's funeral, ostensibly to pay respects, though he'd lingered considerably longer than brief alone required. Roland had made himself a familiar sight around town in those weeks, drinking at the saloon, asking friendly-seeming questions of the ranch hands about how the operation had run under Elias's management. Questions that had seemed at the time like nothing more than a distant relative's idle curiosity about a family he'd never known especially well. Cade had found the marriage stipulation absurd at first, a dead man's old-fashioned meddling reaching from beyond the grave, and had told himself he'd simply let the 6 months lapse and content himself with whatever smaller inheritance the will provided for an unmarried son. He'd never been a man in any particular hurry toward marriage, having watched enough hasty unions among his own friends curdle into resentment within a few short years to feel entirely comfortable waiting for something he actually wanted, rather than something a deadline demanded of him. It hadn't occurred to him, not in those first weeks, that Roland Voss might have decided a faster, more permanent solution suited his own timeline considerably better than waiting patiently for a deadline to pass. That the 6 months Cade had assumed he could simply let lapse in peace might instead be a window Roland intended to ensure he never lived to see close naturally. Adaline had cleaned and stitched the gash along Cade's ribs with the brisk efficiency her father had trained into her, saying nothing about her suspicions until the wound was properly dressed, and had then asked the question directly, drawing on what she'd learned watching her father handle patients who weren't yet ready to trust him with the whole truth. "Fence wire doesn't cut this clean," she said. "This is a blade wound, Mr. Ferris, and not a shallow one. I'd like you to tell me honestly what actually happened, because I can't treat a wound properly if I'm working from a false account of how it was made." Cade was quiet a long moment, weighing something behind his careful expression, his eyes drifting toward the window, where the mountains stood dark against the evening sky. "Man came at me in the dark 3 nights back, near the north pasture," he admitted finally. "Didn't get a clear look at his face. Told myself after it was likely a drifter looking for whatever I was carrying, though I wasn't carrying much of value that night. Told the hands it was a fence accident, because I didn't much want the whole ranch worried over a stranger with a blade wandering the property." "You don't actually believe it was a drifter," Adaline said. "It wasn't quite a question." Cade held her gaze, something guarded shifting behind his eyes. "No," he admitted, "I don't. But I don't have proof of anything else either. An accusing family of trying to kill a man isn't the kind of thing you say out loud in a town this size without considerably more than a bad feeling to back it up." Adaline sat with that a moment, her medical training already working through the implications with the same careful attention she brought to reading a fever's progress. her fingers absently tracing the edge of the fresh bandage she'd just finished tying. "Then, let's find the proof," she said, already turning over in her mind the first careful questions she'd need to ask around town. Because a man who survives one attempt rarely gets warned before the second. Adaline began asking careful questions around Whisper Creek over the following days. The kind of questions a doctor could ask without raising much suspicion. How Elias Ferris's health had declined so quickly at the end, whether anyone had noticed strangers near the Ferris property recently, whether Roland Voss's business in town had ever been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. She learned, piece by piece, a picture considerably more troubling than Cade himself seemed to have assembled. Each new detail settling into place like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was already assembling. The mercantile owner mentioned, unprompted, that Roland had been asking pointed questions about the exact wording of Elias's will, within a week of the funeral, questions specific enough to suggest he'd already seen a copy, rather than simply inquiring out of family curiosity. The county clerk, when Adaline visited under the pretense of an unrelated errand, confirmed that Roland had requested and received a certified copy of the will's full text, including the marriage stipulation, a full 2 weeks before Cade himself had gotten around to reading it properly. And the town's aging physician, Dr. Holbrook, mentioned, when Adaline asked carefully about Elias's final illness, that the fever had come on with unusual speed for a man of Elias's otherwise sound constitution. Fast enough that Holbrook himself had wondered privately whether something in the old man's food or water might have accelerated an illness that should have progressed considerably more slowly. Holbrook admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he dismissed his own suspicion at the time as an old man's overcautious imagination, having no evidence beyond a vague professional unease, and no wish to accuse a grieving family member of anything without cause. The saloon keeper, Adaline's last stop of the afternoon, offered one final thread almost as an afterthought, that Roland had been seen more than once in the company of a rough-looking stranger nobody in town could quite place, the two of them talking low over cards in the corner table some nights, always parting ways separately rather than walking out together. Nobody had thought much of it at the time, a man like Roland being new enough to Whisper Creek himself, that an unfamiliar drinking companion hardly seemed worth remarking on. Adaline noted it down regardless, some instinct telling her the detail might matter more than it appeared to. Adaline sat with the accumulated weight of all 3 conversations that evening, spreading her careful notes across her small office desk by lamplight, the mountains outside her window fading from gold to deep purple as the evening wore on, and understood that what had started as a single suspicious wound had grown, over the course of one day's careful questioning, into something considerably larger and more deliberate than either she or Cade had yet allowed themselves to fully consider. She brought all of it back to Cade, 3 days later, the mountain evening settling gold and quiet over the ranch house porch where they'd taken to sitting during her visits to check his healing wound. "I don't think your father died naturally," she said, watching his face carefully as she said it. "And I don't think the man who cut you in the dark was any stranger at all. I think Roland Voss has been working toward this ranch for considerably longer than a few months, Cade. And I think he intends to have it, whether your 6 months run out naturally or not." Cade absorbed that in silence for a long moment, the mountain wind moving through the pines behind the house, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Adaline hadn't yet heard from him. 3 months left on the will's deadline, he said. "If I marry before then, ranch is mine outright. No further contest possible under the terms my father wrote. If I don't, whether by choice or because I'm simply not alive to make the choice, everything passes to Roland automatically. Clean and legal. No court likely to look twice at the transfer, given how plainly the will's written." "You think he means to make certain you're not alive to see the deadline pass," Adaline said. "Didn't want to believe it," Cade admitted. "Man's my own blood, whatever distance sat between our fathers. But a blade in the dark isn't the kind of thing a man argues himself out of taking seriously. Not twice. He looked at her directly. I don't suppose your doctoring extends to advice on staying alive the next 3 months. Adaline was quiet a moment, turning something over with the same careful deliberation she brought to a difficult diagnosis, watching the last light fade behind the peaks while she worked through the shape of what she was about to propose. There's an obvious solution, she said slowly, though I imagine it'll strike you as considerably more forward than anything a proper courtship would allow. I'm listening, Cade said. Marry before the deadline, and Roland's whole scheme collapses regardless of what he attempts afterward, Adaline said. A completed marriage settles the inheritance immediately and irreversibly, doesn't it? Whatever happens to you after that point, the ranch is already legally secured, which removes his entire motive for wanting you gone before the 6 months lapse. Cade looked at her a long moment, something complicated moving behind his expression. You're offering to marry a man you've known 9 days, he said, purely to remove a murder motive. I'm offering to save your life, using the only tool I actually have available to me, Adaline said. I'm a doctor, Cade Ferris, not a bodyguard. I can't stand watch over you every night for 3 months, but I can sign a piece of paper that makes killing you considerably less useful to the man trying to do it. And I'd rather try something imperfect than watch you take your chances with nothing at all standing between you and the next attempt. Somewhere tonight, in a country I've never visited myself, someone's listening to this story the same way you are right now. Maybe folding laundry, maybe driving home, maybe just sitting quietly letting Adaline and Cade keep them company for a while. If that's you too, a like is a small thing that helps this story find its way to the next person who needs it. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're tuning in from tonight. I read every single one, and it still catches me off guard how far these evenings travel. Now, Cade has to decide whether to accept a proposal built entirely on practical necessity. And neither of them yet realizes how much more complicated that practical arrangement is about to become. He was quiet long enough that Adaline began to wonder whether she'd overstepped considerably further than the situation actually called for. The mountain evening deepening around them into full dusk, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky above the ridgeline. I won't have you sacrifice your own future for a problem that's entirely mine to solve, Cade said finally. You came west to build a life of your own, a practice, a place in this town on your own terms. Marrying a man under threat of murder isn't the kind of arrangement I'd wish on anyone, let alone a woman who's shown me nothing but decency since the night I walked into your office lying about a fence wire. You're not the only one with something to gain from this arrangement, Adaline said. I've spent 4 months in this town watching half the ranchers ride an extra day's distance rather than trust a woman doctor with anything serious. A married woman, established as the wife of a respected rancher, might find considerably more of this town willing to actually let her practice the medicine she's fully capable of providing. I'm not offering purely out of charity, Cade. I'm offering because it solves a genuine problem for both of us, however unconventional the shape of the solution looks from the outside. That's a generous way of describing marrying a man to keep him breathing, Cade said, though something like a smile had started working at the corner of his mouth. I've found generosity tends to work better when it's mutual, Adaline said. I'd rather enter this as a fair trade between two people solving real problems than as one person rescuing another. I don't think either of us would wear the second version comfortably for very long, and I'd rather we both be able to look back on this decision without either of us feeling we'd taken more than we'd given. Cade considered that, the last of the daylight fading gold behind the mountains, the ranch house behind them beginning to glow faintly where someone had lit a lamp inside. 3 months of legal marriage to save my life, he said slowly, in exchange for whatever standing my name might lend your practice in this town. Nothing more expected of either of us beyond that, unless we found ourselves wanting more. Unless we found ourselves wanting more, Adaline agreed. They were married 9 days after that first examination of Cade's wound, in the small white church at the edge of town, the Wind River peaks rising sharp and snow-capped behind it, Wildflowers Cade had picked himself that morning sitting in a jar on the small table where they signed the license, the mountain air carrying the faint sweetness of sage and early summer grass. Reverend Kane had asked, with the gentle delicacy of a man who'd married enough couples to recognize when something unusual sat beneath a wedding surface, whether they were entirely certain of their decision, given how quickly it had all come together. "Certain enough," Cade had said, holding her gaze steadily as he said it, and Adaline had nodded her own agreement, though neither of them had explained the full shape of their certainty to a reverend who likely assumed, same as the rest of Whisper Creek would assume once word spread, that a whirlwind romance rather than a murder plot had brought them to that table. The ceremony itself was brief and plain. No grand declarations exchanged beyond the standard vows the territory's marriage law required, though Adaline found herself saying those ordinary words back to a man she'd known barely more than a week, feeling something considerably more complicated than the pure practicality she'd insisted on at the outset. She caught herself watching how the sunlight caught the gold in his beard, the steady warmth in his eyes that had never once wavered since that first evening on the porch. Signing her name to the license, she knew plainly that practical arrangement was no longer the whole truth of what she felt. Cade, for his part, said nothing of whatever he felt, watching her sign her name beside his, offering only that same warm, unhurried smile he'd worn since she'd first laid out her proposal. A smile Adaline was beginning to suspect carried considerably more meaning than simple relief at having his life saved. Word of the marriage reached Roland Voss within a day, and he arrived at the Ferris ranch the following morning with the controlled fury of a man watching a carefully laid plan collapse in front of him, his horse lathered from the hard ride out from town. "That's a hasty arrangement," Roland said, standing in the ranch yard, his eyes moving between Cade and Adaline with barely concealed calculation. 9 days acquaintance by what I've heard around town. Seems an unusually quick decision for a man who's spent 30 years avoiding exactly this kind of commitment. "Wasn't your business how quickly I decided," Cade said, standing his ground with an ease Adaline hadn't seen from him before. The wound along his ribs healed enough now that he carried himself without the careful guardedness of the past 9 days. "Marriage is legal and recorded at the county clerk's office as of yesterday afternoon. Ranch is settled outright under my father's own will. No further contest available to anyone, whatever timeline you'd been counting on otherwise." Roland's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle working at the corner of his mouth before he mastered it. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, his voice tight despite the effort he was clearly making to keep it level. "Wasn't implying anything specific," Cade said. "Simply informing you the will's condition is fully satisfied, and there's nothing left for you to inherit here, regardless of what happens to me from this point forward. Whatever plans you'd made around my 6-month deadline, I'd consider them thoroughly settled." Roland's composure held, but only barely, and he left without further pretense of cordiality, the dust of his departure settling slowly in the yard, while Cade and Adaline stood watching, both of them understanding plainly that they'd removed his motive without yet removing whatever anger the loss had generated in him. Sheriff Ambrose Cutter arrived at the ranch 3 days later, having received an anonymous tip regarding a stranger seen leaving Whisper Creek's small hardware store with a blade purchase matched, by description, to the wound Adaline had treated on Cade's ribs. Description matches a man who's been seen in Roland Voss's company on 2 separate occasions this past month, Cutter said, standing in the Ferris kitchen with his hat in his hands. Adaline's own careful notes on the timeline of Elias's illness and Roland's suspicious inquiries spread across the table between them, arranged with the same tidy precision she brought to her medical charts. He glanced at the stack, then at her, with the dry appreciation of a lawman who rarely got handed a case already organized this thoroughly. "Wish every witness in this county kept records half this useful, Mrs. Ferris. Might put me out of most of my actual work. Combined with what your doctors put together about the timing of your father's fever and the will inquiries filed considerably earlier than an innocent man's curiosity would explain, I've got enough here to bring Roland in for formal questioning, if you're both willing to testify to what you've observed." "We're willing," Cade said firmly, and Adaline nodded her own agreement beside him, neither of them hesitating for even a moment. The investigation that followed confirmed, over the following weeks, considerably more than either of them had initially suspected. A hired man named Purdy, who'd accepted payment from Roland for the North Pasture attack. Records of arsenic purchased under a false name that matched the accelerated progression of Elias's final illness. And enough physical evidence assembled that Roland Voss found himself facing formal charges rather than a quiet, uncontested inheritance he'd clearly assumed would simply fall into his hands. Purdy himself, once cornered by the sheriff's questioning and faced with the prospect of hanging alone for a scheme that had never been his own idea, proved considerably more willing to talk than Roland had likely anticipated, laying out the full sequence of payments and instructions in exchange for the sheriff's promise to note his cooperation favorably. Cutter rode out to the Ferris ranch himself once the formal charges were filed, delivering the news in person with the same careful, methodical thoroughness he'd brought to the whole investigation from its very first day. "Man's looking at considerable time, whatever the court eventually decides," Cutter said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Attempted murder, and murder outright if the arsenic evidence holds up the way the territorial physician thinks it will once he's finished his own examination. You two did the work that broke this case open. Whatever credit the official report ends up giving a sheriff, who mostly just followed where your notes pointed." "You saved my life twice over," Cade told Adaline that evening, the investigation's conclusion finally settling into something like safety after weeks of uncertainty, the two of them sitting together on the porch as the last of the day's light faded behind the peaks. Once with a marriage certificate, and once with a doctor's careful eye for details a sheriff might never have thought to ask about on his own. "I'd say we saved it together," Adaline said gently. "I only noticed the wound wasn't a fence accident. You're the one who trusted me enough to tell the truth about it, instead of simply letting me stitch a lie closed and sending me on my way." The months that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had entirely expected, from an arrangement built on practical necessity. Adaline's medical practice growing steadily as Cade standing in Whisper Creek lent her exactly the credibility she'd hoped it might. Ranchers who'd once ridden an extra day's distance, now trusting her with broken bones and dangerous fevers alike. Her waiting room busier most weeks than it had ever been before the marriage. She found herself watching Cade work the ranch each morning through her office window, thinking considerably less about the practical terms they'd agreed to, and considerably more about how he'd started bringing her coffee each morning before she'd even finished dressing. How he'd taken to asking about her difficult cases over supper with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. The steady warmth that had never once wavered since that first evening on the porch, when she'd laid out a proposal built entirely on saving his life. She noticed, too, how he'd started mending things around her small office without being asked, the same way he'd once mended fence lines out of pure habit, a loose hinge here, a wobbling shelf there, and had teased him gently about it one evening, telling him he seemed to have a genuine talent for fixing things nobody had actually complained about. "Man gets in the habit of tending what's his to tend," he'd said, and she'd caught in the quiet gentleness of how he'd said it, a meaning that extended well past hinges and shelves. "You've been quiet tonight," Cade observed one evening, the two of them on the porch where so much of their arrangement had first taken shape, the mountains catching the last gold light of a Wyoming sunset. The wildflowers along the fence line grown taller now than when they'd first married that spring. "I've been thinking," Adaline admitted, "that I proposed this marriage telling you plainly it was only to save your life. And I find myself, 4 months later, no longer entirely certain that's still the whole truth of why I want to stay married to you." Cade turned to look at her fully, something hopeful working behind his careful expression. "Been waiting a while to hear you say something like that," he admitted. "Didn't want to push you toward feeling something you hadn't arrived at honestly on your own. But I'll tell you plainly now, since you've been brave enough to say it first. I stopped thinking of this as a practical arrangement considerably before you did, if I'm honest. Somewhere around the third week, watching you defend my life to a sheriff with the same fierce attention you bring to every patient who walks through your door. Then perhaps, Adaline said, we ought to consider staying married for an entirely different reason than the one I originally gave you. Wouldn't argue with that, Cade said, and this time, when he smiled at her, Adaline finally recognized everything that smile had been carrying, unspoken, since the very first morning she'd signed her name beside his at that small table outside the church. Roland Voss was convicted the following spring, the hired man Purdy testifying against him in exchange for a reduced sentence of his own, and the whole affair settled, eventually, into the kind of story Whisper Creek told for years afterward at gatherings and socials. The marriage that started as a legal maneuver and became, by all visible evidence, one of the genuinely happiest matches the town had witnessed in a generation. Adaline's practice grew steadily into the finest in the county, eventually drawing patients from towns considerably further afield than Whisper Creek itself. And she trained, over the years, 2 younger women as her own assistants, determined that no future doctor's daughter would need to prove her competence quite so thoroughly as she'd once had to prove her own. She kept her father's old medical bag on display in her office long after she'd replaced most of its contents with newer, better instruments, telling every young woman who asked about it that the bag itself mattered less than the stubbornness required to keep opening it, morning after morning, in a town slow to trust a woman's hands with anything serious, in the shadow of mountains that had never once cared what anyone believed her capable of. Cade rebuilt the north pasture fence line himself that first spring, the same stretch of ground where he'd nearly lost his life, working the repair slowly and deliberately, as though the physical labor itself were a kind of quiet reckoning with everything that stretch of fence had witnessed. He expanded the herd steadily over the following years, weathering hard winters and dry summers with the same patient competence his father had once worried he lacked, and found himself more than once grateful for a stipulation in a dead man's will that he'd once considered nothing more than old-fashioned meddling. Some mornings, riding that same north pasture at dawn, with the mountains catching the first light and the whole valley still quiet around him, he thought about how close he'd come to never seeing any of it again, and let the gratitude settle into him the same unhurried way most things did. He kept, framed in his study, the original marriage license Adaline had signed that first morning, not as a legal document anymore, but as a reminder, he told visitors who asked about it, of the exact moment a practical arrangement had quietly begun turning into something neither of them had planned for, but both had, eventually, chosen freely and completely. They renewed their vows on their 5th anniversary in that same small white church, the Wind River peaks still standing sharp and magnificent behind it. Wildflowers grown thick and wild along the same fence line where Cade had once picked a modest jar's worth for their first wedding. And this time, Adaline told the gathered town plainly, she wasn't marrying Cade Ferris to save his life at all. I'm marrying him, she said, because somewhere in the process of saving it, I fell in love with the man wearing it. There's something worth sitting with in the difference between the reason Adaline gave for that first marriage and the reason she gave for the second one, 5 years later, in that very same church. The first reason was entirely true and entirely insufficient to explain everything that actually happened between 2 people forced together by urgency and danger. She really was only marrying him to save his life that first morning. And love, as it turns out, doesn't much care whether the door it walks through was opened for practical reasons or romantic ones. It simply finds its way in regardless, given enough patient, ordinary mornings to work with. Coffee brought unasked, a shelf mended that nobody had complained about, a woman's fierce testimony to a sheriff, standing in for words neither of them had yet found the courage to speak plainly. Cade never once tried to rush her past the practical arrangement into something more, content to let his own feelings grow quietly in the background, while she needed the certainty of a fair trade rather than a rescue. That patience, I think, is what actually made room for real love to arrive honestly. Rather than being declared prematurely under the pressure of a shared crisis, neither of them had chosen. A lesser man might have mistaken her gratitude for affection and pressed his advantage before she'd had room to discover her own genuine feelings. Cade simply waited, mended what needed mending, and let the truth arrive in its own time. Some of the truest marriages, it turns out, start with the most practical possible sentence a person can say to another, and become, given enough time and enough ordinary mornings together, something neither of them could have predicted when they first sat down to sign their names beneath a small church with mountains rising behind it. Thank you, truly, for spending this evening with us beneath the peaks above Whisper Creek. Until the next story finds you, keep riding.